The small white chapel on Route 49 in rural Mississippi hasn't had a Sunday service in 3 years. The sign out front still reads, "All are welcome," but the doors are padlocked shut, and kudzu vines are slowly swallowing the steeple. Inside, hymnals gather dust in the pews where 3 generations of the Henderson family once sang every Sunday morning. This isn't an isolated incident. It's happening across what we call the Bible Belt, and the numbers are staggering in ways that would have seemed impossible just 2 decades ago. Between 2010 and 2020, over 4,500 Southern Baptist churches closed their doors permanently. That's more than one church every single day for 10 years straight. The Southern Baptist Convention, once the largest Protestant denomination in America with over 16 million members, has now hemorrhaged more than 2 million members since 2006. But here's what makes this even more startling. This is happening in the region of America that literally defined itself by its Christianity, where religion wasn't just what you believed, it was who you were. Drive through any small town in Alabama, Georgia, or Tennessee, and you'll see them. The abandoned churches. Some have been converted into antique shops or coffee houses. Others just sit empty, their parking lots cracked and overgrown, their stained glass windows boarded up like closed eyes. In Little Rock, Arkansas, a mega church that once drew 4,000 people every Sunday now hosts a trampoline park. The baptismal pool is still there, hidden beneath the front desk. Pastor James Whitfield has been preaching in rural Kentucky for 42 years. He remembers when his church had 200 regular attendees, when they had to add a second Sunday service to accommodate everyone, when the youth group alone had 50 teenagers. Today, on a good Sunday, maybe 35 people show up. Most of them are over 65. "I've buried more members than I've baptized in the last 5 years, he told a local newspaper last year, his voice breaking. We're not just losing members, we're losing our future. The data tells a story that sounds almost apocalyptic if you're a church leader in these regions. In 2008, approximately 76% of Southerners identified as Christian. By 2021, that number had dropped to 64%. The decline isn't gradual anymore, it's accelerating. Among Americans under 30 in the South, less than half attend church regularly, compared to over 65% of their grandparents' generation at the same age. We're not talking about a gentle drift away from religion. This is a wholesale abandonment happening in real time, in the very region that once sent more missionaries overseas than anywhere else in America. But to understand how dramatic this really is, you need to understand what the Bible Belt actually meant, not just as a religious region, but as an identity. The term was coined in 1924 by journalist H. L. Mencken to describe the areas of the South and Midwest where evangelical Protestantism was so dominant it shaped everything. Laws, culture, social norms, business practices, even what days stores could open. In many counties across Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, you still can't buy alcohol on Sundays. That's how deep this religious identity ran. For most of the 20th century, church attendance in the South wasn't just common, it was expected. It was social currency. If you didn't attend church, you weren't just irreligious, you were suspect. You wouldn't get certain jobs. Your kids might not get invited to birthday parties. Entire social networks revolved around Wednesday night prayer meetings and Sunday potlucks. The church wasn't just a building you visited once a week, it was the gravitational center of community life. I want to know something from you watching this. Where are you watching from right now, and what's your relationship with organized religion? Are you in one of these communities watching churches close around you? Or are you somewhere else watching this transformation from a distance? Drop your location and your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And here at Professor Archive, we spend countless hours researching these deep dives into the stories that shape our world. If this documentary adds value to your day, consider leaving a super thanks. It directly supports the research that goes into these videos and helps us keep going deeper into the topics that matter. Sarah Martinez grew up in a small town outside of Jackson, Mississippi. Every Sunday without fail, her family attended First Baptist Church. It wasn't a choice, it was just what you did, like going to school or eating dinner. She sang in the choir, attended youth group, went to church camp every summer. When she turned 18 and went to college in 2015, she stopped going to church entirely. It wasn't this dramatic crisis of faith, she explained in an interview. I just realized I'd been going because everyone expected me to, not because I believed any of it. And once I was away from home, once that social pressure was gone, I never went back. There are millions of stories like Sarah's, but they're happening disproportionately in the Bible Belt itself, which is the twist nobody predicted. Researchers call them no-knees, people who check none when asked about religious affiliation. In 1970, only about 5% of Southerners were nones. Today, it's approaching 30% in some Southern states. The fastest growing religious category in the Bible Belt isn't another denomination, it's no religion at all. The Southern Baptist Convention held an emergency meeting in 2022 to address what they called the baptism crisis. In 2021, they performed the fewest baptisms since 1947, despite the U.S. population being more than twice as large. Think about that. In 1947, in a country of roughly 144 million people, Southern Baptists baptized more new believers than they did in 2021, when the population exceeded 330 million. The math is devastating. They're not just failing to grow, they're collapsing. Pastor Mike Reynolds in rural Georgia has watched his congregation shrink from 180 members to 47 in less than 8 years. The church budget has been slashed repeatedly. They can't afford a youth pastor anymore, or a music director, or even part-time administrative help. Reynolds now works a second job at a hardware store to make ends meet. I pour everything I have into Sunday's sermon, he said, and I look out at the pews on Sunday morning, and there are all these empty spaces where families used to sit. The Johnson family, gone. The Parkers, gone. The Williamson kids grew up and moved away and never came back. You start to wonder what you're doing wrong. But here's the thing. It's not just about what individual pastors are doing wrong. The forces driving this collapse are massive, structural, and in many ways, irreversible. Let's talk about the economic reality first. The Bible Belt is also America's poorest region. Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, and West Virginia consistently rank among the bottom 10 states for median household income. Poverty rates in rural areas of these states can exceed 25%. When you're working 2 jobs to keep food on the table, when you don't have reliable transportation, when you can't afford childcare, Sunday morning church attendance becomes a luxury you can't afford, regardless of your beliefs. Churches themselves are feeling the economic squeeze. Tithing, the practice of donating 10% of your income to the church, used to be the bedrock of church finances in the South. But as younger generations earn less, carry more student debt, and face higher living costs, tithing has plummeted. A 2019 study found that only about 3% of adults who attend a church actually tithe. 3%. Churches that relied on tithing to pay their mortgage, their pastor's salary, their utilities suddenly can't keep the lights on. In 2019, the United Methodist Church announced plans to close or merge thousands of churches over the next decade, with the heaviest concentrations in the South. The Presbyterian Church USA has closed over 200 churches since 2015. The Episcopal Church has seen its Sunday attendance drop by nearly a third in 20 years. Denominations that once seemed permanent fixtures of the Southern landscape are retrenching, consolidating, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. Then COVID-19 hit, and it accelerated everything. When churches were forced to close during the pandemic, something unexpected happened. Millions of regular attendees discovered they didn't actually miss it. They didn't miss waking up early on Sunday. They didn't miss getting dressed up. They didn't miss the social obligations and the pressure to volunteer. Some churches pivoted to online services, but study after study showed that online church attendance plummeted the moment in-person services resumed. People who had attended faithfully for decades simply never came back. A survey by the Barna Group in 2021 found that 1 in 3 practicing Christians who were attending church regularly before COVID either stopped attending entirely or reduced their attendance to once a month or less. In the Bible Belt specifically, the numbers were even higher. Pastors reported losing between 30 and 50% of their pre-pandemic attendance permanently. Not temporarily, permanently. 62-year-old Linda Hartwell was one of those people. She had attended the same church in rural Tennessee for 38 years. During COVID, the church went online. At first, I watched every Sunday, Linda said, but then one Sunday I slept in, and nothing happened. The world didn't end. I didn't feel guilty, and I realized I'd been showing up out of habit and obligation, not because it was feeding my soul. She hasn't been back since. Multiply Linda's story by millions, and you begin to understand the scale of this transformation. But the economic and pandemic factors only tell part of the story. There's a generational shift happening that's even more fundamental. Young people in the Bible Belt are leaving in droves, not just leaving church, but leaving the region entirely. Rural counties across Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas are experiencing population decline for the first time since the Great Depression. Young people graduate high school and leave for college or job opportunities in cities, and they don't come back. They move to Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Houston, or they leave the South entirely. The churches they grew up in lose their young families, their children, their future. What's left behind is an aging congregation trying to maintain a building and a tradition that no longer has roots in the community. The average age in many rural Southern churches now exceeds 60 years old. There are churches where the youngest regular attendee is in their 40s. No children in Sunday school. No teenagers in youth group. Just aging believers holding on to something that's slipping away. Demographer Ryan Burge has documented this trend extensively. He notes that in many Southern counties, churches are trapped in what he calls death spirals. Younger members leave. Income drops. The church can't afford a full-time pastor or youth programs. This makes the church even less attractive to younger families who might visit. More people leave. Income drops further. Eventually, the church closes. The remaining members either join another struggling church nearby, creating a slightly larger struggling church, or they just stop attending altogether. But there's another factor driving this collapse that doesn't get discussed as much, and it's deeply uncomfortable for church leadership. The politicization of American Christianity, especially in the South. For decades, the evangelical church and conservative politics were intertwined so tightly you couldn't separate them. That was fine when most church attendees were politically homogeneous, but over the last 15 years, that's changed dramatically. A 2022 survey found that nearly 40% of adults who left their church in the previous 2 years cited political divisions as a major factor. They described pastors endorsing political candidates from the pulpit, sermons that spent more time on cultural war issues than on scripture, church communities that became hostile to anyone who didn't share specific political views. Young people especially reported feeling alienated by churches that seemed more interested in political power than in spiritual growth. 28-year-old Marcus Thompson grew up in a Baptist church in South Carolina. His family had been members for 3 generations. In 2020, he stopped attending after his pastor delivered a sermon explicitly linking political party affiliation with Christian faithfulness. It wasn't like he suggested one party aligned better with Christian values, Marcus said. He literally said if you vote a certain way, you're not a real Christian. I looked around that room and I realized this wasn't church anymore. It was a political rally with hymns. The scandal reports haven't helped either. The Southern Baptist Convention faced a devastating reckoning in 2022 when an independent investigation revealed that denominational leaders had mishandled sexual abuse allegations for nearly 2 decades, often protecting pastors and dismissing victims. The report documented hundreds of cases of abuse and cover-ups. The fallout has been catastrophic for trust in church leadership, particularly among women and younger members who are far less willing than previous generations to give institutional authority the benefit of the doubt. Abuse scandals have rocked megachurches across the Bible Belt. Financial scandals have exposed pastors living lavishly off donations from struggling congregants. High-profile ministry leaders have been caught in lies, affairs, and corruption. Each scandal chips away at the credibility that American Christianity, particularly in the South, had built up over centuries. And in an age of social media and instant information, these scandals spread faster and stick longer than ever before. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of this church collapse is what's replacing traditional church attendance in the Bible Belt. Many people who have left organized religion haven't become atheists. Instead, they describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. They still pray, they still believe in God, many still identify as Christian, but they've divorced those beliefs from institutional church attendance. They might worship through podcasts, online communities, or personal spiritual practices that don't require a building or a denomination. There's also been a notable rise in what sociologists call cafeteria Christianity, where individuals pick and choose which aspects of Christian teaching they accept and which they reject, creating highly personalized faith experiences that previous generations would have considered heretical. Traditional church authority, the idea that a pastor or denomination determines correct belief, has collapsed among younger believers. They trust their own spiritual intuition more than institutional teaching. In some ways, this represents the ultimate conclusion of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther argued every believer could interpret Scripture for themselves without priestly mediation. 500 years later, that logic has led to millions of individual believers creating their own spiritual paths, untethered from communal worship or institutional structures. The Bible Belt churches are casualties of the very individualism that Protestant Christianity championed. The financial implications of this collapse extend far beyond church budgets. In many small southern towns, the local church is the largest employer after the school district. It employs pastors, administrative staff, maintenance workers, childcare providers. When churches close, those jobs disappear. Church buildings often serve as community centers, hosting everything from AA meetings to free meals to after-school programs. When they shut down, those services vanish. Churches also represent significant real estate assets. A church building in a small town might be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but there's no market for it. Who wants to buy a church in a declining town with no economic prospects? Many churches simply abandon their buildings when they close, leaving communities with deteriorating structures that become eyesores and attract vandalism. Some counties have dozens of abandoned church buildings they can't afford to demolish and can't convince anyone to purchase. Theological seminaries across the South are closing or consolidating. New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary has seen its enrollment drop by more than 40% since 2010. These institutions train pastors, but the job market for pastors in the Bible Belt is contracting rapidly. Young people considering ministry look at the statistics and choose different careers. Why spend years training for a profession where churches are closing, salaries are declining, and the social status that once came with being a pastor has evaporated? The few churches that are growing in the South tend to be large contemporary megachurches in suburban areas with rock band worship services, coffee shops in the lobby, and casual dress codes. They are not your grandmother's Baptist church. They represent a complete reimagining of what church can be, stripped of most traditional liturgy and ritual, designed to appeal to modern sensibilities. But even these churches struggle to reach younger generations and maintain growth. Some pastors are adapting in creative ways. There are churches experimenting with weeknight services for people who work Sundays. Churches focused entirely on community service and activism rather than traditional worship. Churches that meet in bars or coffee shops instead of traditional buildings. House churches where 10 or 15 people gather in someone's living room. These experiments acknowledge that the traditional Sunday morning service model is dying, and something new needs to emerge. But the numbers suggest these innovations aren't happening fast enough or at sufficient scale to reverse the broader trend. Lifeway Research conducted a study in 2019 that projected if current trends continue, half of all churches in America will close by 2050. In the Bible Belt specifically, the projection is even grimmer, with potentially 2/3 of rural churches closing within 30 years. What does that mean for the communities left behind? For many small southern towns, the church was the last remaining institution, binding the community together. The school might have consolidated with a neighboring district. The local hospital might have closed. Main Street businesses might have gone under when Walmart came to the county seat. But the church remained, a place where people knew each other's names, where weddings and funerals happened, where you could find help if you were struggling. When that disappears, what holds these communities together? Some sociologists argue we're witnessing the end of Christendom in America, the long historical period when Christianity was the default assumed cultural framework. For 400 years, American public life was shaped by Christian assumptions, Christian holidays, Christian moral frameworks. That's ending, and the Bible Belt, ironically, is leading the way. The very region that was most intensely Christian is experiencing the most dramatic de-Christianization. Others point out that Christianity has survived plenty of institutional collapses throughout its 2,000-year history. The faith existed for centuries before church buildings and denominations. It survived the fall of Rome, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and countless other transformations. Maybe what we're seeing isn't the death of Christian faith in the South, but the death of a particular institutional expression of that faith, one that emerged in the 20th century and is now obsolete. Pastor David Chen pastors a multi-ethnic church in suburban Atlanta that's actually growing. He believes the future of Christianity in the South won't look like the past. The old model was cultural Christianity, he explained. You were Christian because everyone around you was Christian. You went to church because that's what respectable people did. That's over. The Christianity that survives will be more intentional, more diverse, less tied to political power or cultural dominance. It'll be smaller, but maybe more genuine. The irony isn't lost on anyone that the Bible Belt is bleeding out while Christianity grows explosively in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Nigeria alone will likely have more Christians than the United States within a decade. The global center of Christianity has already shifted away from Europe and North America. The story of Christianity in the 21st century is being written in Lagos, Seoul, and São Paulo, not in Jackson, Mississippi, or Birmingham, Alabama. For all the talk of Christian nationalism and the political influence of evangelical voters, the actual data shows a religion in rapid decline in its American heartland. Politicians still court evangelical support because older evangelicals vote reliably, but the demographic future tells a different story. Every year, the evangelical voting bloc gets older, smaller, and less influential. Within 20 years, American Christianity may be politically irrelevant in the South, something that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. What remains to be seen is whether this collapse stabilizes at some lower plateau or continues until the Christianity of the Bible Belt exists only in history books and documentary videos like this one. Will there still be Baptist churches in rural Mississippi in 2075? Probably some, but it's entirely possible your grandchildren will think of American Christianity the way we think of sharecropping or company towns, something that once defined a region but faded into obsolescence. The small white chapel on Route 49 in Mississippi, where we started this story, represents thousands of similar buildings across the South. Silent, empty, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Each one was built by people who believed it would stand forever, who couldn't imagine a world where their children and grandchildren wouldn't fill those pews. They were wrong. This is the story nobody wanted to tell. The secret that pastors and denominational leaders tried to hide behind optimistic projections and faith that revival was just around the corner. But the numbers don't lie. The Bible Belt is bleeding out, and no amount of prayer meetings or church growth seminars has stopped it. What took 400 years to build is unraveling in a single generation, and the America that emerges from this transformation will be fundamentally different from the one we've known. The question isn't whether this is happening. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is what it means, where it leads, and what, if anything, rises from these ashes. That's a question without a clear answer, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most unsettling thing of all. History is happening in real time in the American South, and none of us knows how this story ends.